नमस्कार, मैं डॉक्टर विनय श्रीवास्तव इस वक्त आयरलैंड यूनाइटेड किंगडम में हूँ। इस वक्त हम आयरलैंड की राजधानी डबलिन में हैं और डबलिन का सिटी टूर कर रहे हैं। सिटी टूर हम बस से कर रहे हैं, इसलिए आज मैं आपको डबलिन का सिटी टूर वाया बस दिखाऊंगा। और डबलिन एक ऐतिहासिक शहर है आयरलैंड का और काफ़ी पुराना शहर है। तो मैं अभी डबलिन शहर के कुछ प्रमुख हिस्सों को आपको दिखाता चलूँगा। आयरलैंड की राजधानी डबलिन का ये सिटी व्यू।
This is dedicated to all those who ever lost their lives in the struggle for Irish freedom. Very important rallying point for
रेडिश स्टोन में यहाँ के मकानों का
parades. Our St. Patrick's Day parade, in fact, just starts
कॉलोनियल
up beyond
आर्किटेक्ट से
here.
प्रेरित है।
Comes right down
जिस
the
तरह
route
से
we're taking
लंदन
all the
की
way down
अधिकांश
O'Connell Street. So if you're here on the
आवासीय
17th of March,
बिल्डिंग्स
you would have
रेडिश
about
स्टोन में
half a
बनी है।
million people
ठीक
cheering
इसी
for you
तरह
as you
आयरलैंड
came
में
down
भी
the street here.
आवासीय भवन और अन्य भवन अभी
Now,
तक
in
तो
the
रेडिश
middle
स्टोन में ही
of
दिखाई पड़
O'Connell
रहे हैं।
Street, you can't fail to notice the highest structure in the centre of the city here is city, because they eventually held a competition, and Dubliners just couldn't understand how anyone won a competition to design what is basically a knitting needle. It wasn't exactly what we were promised, and really was never finished to the specifications that we were told it would be. But I guess it's become a meeting place. Later on today you'll see groups gathered round the base, friends, people meeting friends. 16 Easter Rising. Easter weekend 1916, Patrick Pearse and his men took up positions in buildings across the city, key buildings in opposition to English rule. Now the rising wasn't very successful, but on Easter Sunday morning, Pearse came outside this building here and read the proclamation, the rights of the men and women of Ireland. A very important turning point. Later, he decided to surrender, and they were all executed. And it was their executions that actually led to the War of Independence. People were shocked that they were executed because he had surrendered. They weren't soldiers. He was a school teacher. None of them fighting with the clock on the front of Cleary's. Before we had the Spire as a meeting place, Cleary's was the meeting place here in Dublin. If you said to someone, meet me under the clock at Cleary's, you were guaranteed they'd show up. In fact, my parents met for their very first date under that clock. Years later, my father admitted he'd arrived and hid around the corner at the side of the store, let my mother stand under the clock thinking she'd arrive first, driving down to Glendalough, the reservoir up in the Wicklow Hills. And just to your right here is Daniel O'Connell, the man that we have the street here near here in Dublin. Now, if you're on the right, you might just spot some bullet holes in his angels, because during the War of Independence, it's got a view up and down the river. Just to your right there, you'll see the little the very first pedestrian bridge over the river. Until the 1700s, we'd no bridges at all. It was the ferryman who brought you across the river. So when they put the bridge in, he lost his business. He was so angry, they eventually gave him a lease and let him charge people a half a penny to cross. Nowadays, completely free. No sooner said it than he died. And the girls were tripping over his dead body to get in. Now there's a statue of George in the front quadrangle. And on International Women's Day, it's become a little bit of an event where the girls organise a parade across to George, where they then throw their underwear at him. So with Trinity coming up, you'll see the main entrance to Trinity on the left, and over to the right, another big Georgian building of Dublin, our old Parliament building. Now this was opened in 1720. By 1800, we had done away with the Parliament. We had direct rule from London, so this big building was sold to the Bank of Ireland. Shapes of windows but no glass. This is because in 1720 there was a glass tax. This was done away with. The bank owned the building, and I'm guessing they decided it was just safer not to have glass windows in their bank. Now we're just coming around into the busy south stores that belong there. At the far end of the street is an indoor shopping mall, St. Stephen's Green Shopping Mall. So we come right around, and as again later on, if you're wandering about, you won't get lost, just find Trinity. And this street we're on is Nassau Street, so this is where we do our drop-offs and our pick-ups. So basically this is the Central Museum. Doesn't open early on a Monday, it opens at 1 o'clock I think on a Monday, so it'll be open this afternoon if anyone wants to pop in. Free to find one. So all available up there for free. Now just to your left on the side of the building. Now he drank in a pub around the corner and had spotted her leaving work on a few occasions and approached her. She didn't quite fancy him and ignored him. So then he took to writing to her and she continued to ignore him until he wore her down so much eventually she agreed to step out with him, just to get rid of him I think. Now some might find that romantic, but I should think today she'd report him as a stalker. But a little bit romantic maybe, because we've Bloomsday coming up soon. Bloomsday is the 16th of June, the day Samuel Beckett, Patrick Kavanagh, Brendan Behan, the Dublin writer, who once described himself as a serious drinker with a writing problem. So you can see his priorities were probably at the bottom of a glass of Guinness and Kennedy's there. And just as we go through the traffic lights, on our right, it's still got its original chemist shop interior. And this brings us around to Merrion Square. Now Merrion Square was the grandest address you could have in Dublin in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Anyone who was anyone. He's on a big lump of Wicklow granite, looking across to his boyhood home. You'll see him between the trees there, probably wondering where it all went wrong for him. Now this side of Merrion Square, several important buildings here in the city. On my right, the first big building is our National Art Gallery. 4,500 works of art all waiting in there for you to see. Next to that is our Parliament building, the Doyle we call it, where our parliaments sit. And next to that again behind the trees is the Natural History Museum. Now really a museum of a museum. It's got all its original Victorian fixtures and fittings full of dead stuffed Victorian animals. So we sometimes refer to it as the Dead Zoo here in Dublin. And then just across the road here on my left at number 24, this black hole door, another president used to live there and then went on twice to be Prime Minister of England. Now, like many people, you probably didn't realise there was an Irish connection because he wiped out his Irish history. It said he didn't like Ireland, he particularly didn't like Dublin, and could be very rude about us. Now, when he was on one occasion, he was approached by Daniel O'Connell, the man whose statue you saw on O'Connell Street. And Daniel O'Connell said, "Sir, were you not born in Dublin?" To which the Duke replied, "Because one is born in a stable does not make one a horse." To which Daniel O'Connell replied, "That fiddle is on the wall of O'Donoghue's pub." So O'Donoghue's famous for music here in the city, ballads and traditional music. In the 1960s we had a big ballad revival, and groups like the Dubliners, the Clancy Brothers, all started their careers in O'Donoghue's pub. You'll still find local musicians playing at night. They get paid in pints, pint of plain or a pint of the black stuff as we call it, otherwise known as a pint of Guinness. Now this brings us around to Fitzwilliam Square, which is another of the Georgian squares here in Dublin, particularly well known for some of the lovely Georgian doorways. Now you'll notice with the doorways the semicircle of glass, the fan light above the door, and some of them with the original patterns, the original glasswork, where you see quite intricate designs. You can take it that these are fireplaces, furniture, the gowns, the wigs, and that was often just the gentlemen. I am aware of the lion in the house next door to the decorative doors. I've no idea why he's there. And
आयरलैंड की सभी
drawing
बिल्डिंग्स
room,
की
slightly
स्थापत्य
smaller
कला
windows were
बिल्कुल अनूठी
generally
है।
the family
यहाँ
bedrooms,
बहुत
and then
छोटे
at the
दरवाजे
very
होते
top,
हैं
the little
और
windows, the
खिड़कियाँ भी
staff
बहुत
quarters.
छोटी हैं।
They didn't need the long windows because they were down in the basement doing the work all day. That's where the kitchens were, all the practical work went on. And then, of course, all the chimney pots up on the roofs. This is because, what can I say, this is Dublin. We may not get the 4 seasons, we certainly get 3 seasons in a day. We start off with sunshine, we go to rain, maybe a bit of hail, maybe even fall on
Education
tomorrow.
library.
If it rains, it gets damp, and believe me, I grew up in this city. The damp gets into your bones after a while. Now this is going to bring us out onto St. Stephen's Green, which is the largest around the squares. So you had to be wealthy, you had to have a key to get into the parks. But in the mid-1800s, Lord Ardilaun, who was the great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the man who founded the brewery, he personally bought the land here and paid to have it landscaped, and then he handed it over to the citizens of Dublin as a public park, which it still remains to this day. So a hugely, and so popular with Dubliners, we have songs written about walking through St. Stephen's Green. So if you do go for a stroll through it later on, I just say steer clear above the Royal College of Surgeons, which is one of the oldest medical schools in the world. Now, we've been sending surgeons out from Dublin since the late 1600s, and even to this day, in the 17 and 1800s, College of Surgeons needed bodies to practice on. So it started a trend for what were known as the resurrectionists or the body snatchers. So there was a large graveyard not too far from here, and a body delivered into the back door there. In fact, 2 bodies a year was equal to an average man's wage back then. So although it was illegal, it was very lucrative. But if they did catch you, they would hang you. And once they'd hung you, your body was handed over to the College of Surgeons. So certain justice in it. Now coming down here, passing Victorian architecture, we've moved away from the Georgian Quarter. Just back there on our right with the little Lucky Duck pub. Now you would have had a little corner home to the relics and the heart of St. Valentine. So the man who costs everyone a fortune on the 14th of February, what is left of his remains are in the church in there, in a shrine. The Pope granted them to the Carmelite order. They own the church there. To my left there with the little striped canopy, the long hall, beautiful Victorian interior to that pub. And then on our right, the very Gothic style loved by the Victorians. They loved all things Gothic, with turrets and pointed windows. And just through the green gates there, we have Georgia Street Shopping Arcade. Purpose-built little arcade in the 1860s, built with the grounds of Dublin Castle. Now, I mentioned earlier the castle itself dating back to the 1100s. But unfortunately, most of it blew up in the 1600s, the go-to area in the city. More interestingly, perhaps the little old cobblestone streets of old Dublin to be found in the Temple Bar district. This whole area inside the walls of the original town of Dublin. Just to your left, you'll see one of the old gateways into the castle. And this large building out here, nothing whatsoever to do with the castle. This was the former Royal Exchange, now our City Hall. And in behind City Hall, the state apartments, all that red brick building that you see. Now up at the top here, we've one of the oldest buildings in Dublin. This is Christchurch Cathedral. Now we could go right back to Viking times. We know in 1030 that the Vikings had put a wooden church on this site. Now they came in here as pagan people, but here's to the cathedral. So he paid about 10 million to fix up the cathedral. But George had been travelling. He'd been to Venice where he'd seen the bridge of size and decided we needed a version of it here in Dublin. So he added the little bridge you see at the far end. Putting a bridge onto the side of what is now a listed building. Well, back in the 1860s he was paying about 10 million, so he could do what he liked really. And then on the far side he added... Now Christchurch Cathedral was just inside the walls of the city. Down here we have our second cathedral, St. Patrick's, which was just outside the walls of the city. Archbishop Cumming, the man who founded St. Patrick's also in the 12th century, came outside the walls because it meant he wasn't subject to the rules and the taxes of the city once he came out here, but he was close enough to have a congregation. So clever like St. Patrick, when they were repairing this cathedral in the 1860s, just inside the gates here, where those plants are, was the old well of St. Patrick. Now, as you can imagine, this cathedral also needed work done in the 1860s. So the brewers, the Guinness family, stepped forward. There was always a rivalry between the brewers and the distillers. And Benjamin Lee Guinness, another great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, you'll see Benjamin Lee on the left there, he came down, and just to outdo the whiskey makers, he spent 11 million down here repairing the cathedral. In fact, it's thanks to him the cathedral's standing at all. It was built for all these centuries. And just on my left you'll see that old Gothic gate there. That's the gateway in the city. They say Archbishop Marsh himself appears at midnight, rummaging through the books, looking for a letter from his niece. He was her guardian, but obviously not a great guardian because she ran away with a sailor. She was supposed to have left him a letter, but he never found it, so he now spends the afterlife looking for it. We have certainly adopted them. We have the Bram Stoker Festival here every Halloween, which has become very popular. And one of the most famous deans of St. Patrick's Cathedral was another writer, Jonathan Swift, the man who wrote Gulliver's Travels. Now, he was the dean here in the early 1700s. Very good man by all accounts, very generous to the poor, but also quite eccentric. He would give a sermon, it said, on a Sunday that went on for more than 4 hours sometimes. So, not content to stay in the pulpit at the top of the cathedral, he had his own one made of wood. He put it on wheels, and he used to get a servant to push him around the cathedral so that he could find the people who had fallen asleep 2.5 or 3 hours into his sermon. One of his sermons is in a glass. Not just the apartments here, but several little housing complexes around the city to house their workers. They saw the wisdom of having good housing, so their workers would be healthy, they could sleep well, and then come in and do all that brewing the next day. They were way ahead of their time really, because they had health plans, pensions, long before companies were obliged to provide these type of things for their employees. In fact, Dublin girls were often told, if you're looking for a good husband, good steady income, find yourself a Guinness man. In fact, they were so generous, there was a tap in the yard before he went home. No longer condoned, have to point out, we don't encourage drinking on the job these days. But I suppose back in the late 1800s, early 20th century, the Guinness was probably safer than the drinking water. We were kids, if you coughed, if you sneezed, to the left you'll see. And the first sighting of them at this point in the river was 60 longships. So if you can imagine 60 all rowing up the River Liffey. So you've got the replica longship there. And just to the right is where they settled. In fact, when they were digging the foundations for these modern buildings here, they started digging in the 1970s. They found thousands and thousands of Viking artifacts. Everything from weapons to jewellery to pottery. And all of those, or a lot of those. Now from Viking history, just back behind us now, on this side of the street, the Pale. We've got one of the old city gates here. In fact, they've even put the date above the gate for you, 1240. would have been several of those gates around the city, so they locked them up at night for protection of the citizens, and then in the morning the gates were open, people came out here. The tradition being, if you misbehaved, they brought you out here, and very quickly you found your head up on that city wall, maybe on a couple of spikes by the city gate. Now we're coming down onto our River Liffey. We're going to be turning left down here, and just on our left, before the traffic lights, is Dublin's oldest pub, the Brazen Head. So we know, because we got the paperwork, in 1198 there was a tavern on this site. After they'd finished building that city wall, they were very, very thirsty, so across here they came for a few cold pints. Now there's a constant dispute as to whether it's the oldest in the country. There is a place in the middle of the country, in a place called Athlone, that dispute they are older, but as I say, we definitely have the paperwork to prove they were here in 1198. Now, like the library, it's also said to be haunted. They say Robert Emmet, our great patriot, he was hung and beheaded up the road here in 1804, that he appears at the bar at midnight, and so too does his executioner, because he used to live above the bar. Now, the one thing you'll find in Ireland is the later you stay in the bar, the more Guinness you're drinking, perhaps a few whiskey chasers, the more likely you are to see those ghosts. Now you're looking into the barge they have down by the past O'Connell Bridge that we came over, but they can only bring it out when the conditions are completely perfect. Now just to your right there is one of the newest bridges across the River Liffey. This is the James Joyce Bridge, named after the writer, because just to the left of the bridge there's a tall red brick house, Georgian style. This was a house that Joyce knew very well. 4 of his aunts lived in this house. So just on our left here. He used that house as a setting for one of his short stories, The Dead, which was part of a collection known as Dubliners. Now, we're coming past this blue bridge. From this bridge to the next bridge, which we're going to go over, back to the north side, everything on your left is the Guinness here. Negotiated his very first lease, a 9,000-year lease on his original site at James's Gate, as it's known. He wasn't a wealthy young man. He worked as a servant for a bishop, but the bishop obviously saw potential. Left him £100 in his will. He used half the money on the lease and the rest he spent on the brewing equipment. And as they say, the rest was history. They now own 52 acres of prime real estate here in the city. Houston train station opened in 1844. First railway track ever laid in the city in 1840. And just to our left, that little bridge, 1821, that won a competition judged by one of the King Georges. So for a long time this area was just known as the King's Bridge area here in Dublin. Now you get a much better view of Guinness from this side of the river. So everything you're looking at, every building you see there, every chimney, all belongs to Guinness. In fact, the site is so big these days, there's a public road cuts their site in half. They actually have tunnels under the road to connect both sides of the brewery. And down at this end, live and rising, you'll see the trucks this morning delivering the barley. So those trucks you see tipped up, they are delivering the barley. This is where they take the barley in at this end, they wash it, they roast it. Now I grew in Smithfield Plaza, but all their distilling is actually done down at Middleton in County Cork these days, because the site there got a little too small for them, so they're doing all the distilling down in Cork. But you can still go in, visit it, taste the whiskey. But like the castle, they had an explosion when they were unloading gunpowder. That big building back to your left there is our forecourts. the original courts building here in Dublin. The oldest Norman parish church in the city. So unlike the cathedrals, it's quite a simple piece of Norman architecture. If you like your Norman architecture, this is a beautiful little church, lovely old building. And the city wall actually came right up here, curved around, continued across to our right. There was another gate just where the main road is there, and that was the main road. Just on the right there, that red brick building with the tall arched windows, that was the Tailors Guildhall. Now, because the linen and the leather, the tanning industries were so smelly, they were banished outside the city walls. So the Liberties became a great area for the fabric industries here in Dublin. So you get a much closer look. You'll be able to look over the railings. You'll see right down into some of the much older foundations. And just to our left here, the Dublinia Museum. As I mentioned, it's the Viking Museum of Dublin, what they call a living museum. So you can go in and shake hands with a genuine Viking. Junior school, we're still learning at the end of high school, where we take an exam in Irish. So in theory, we all have what's known as a cúpla focal. We're not being rude when we say cúpla focal. It simply means a few words. Cúpla is few, focal is word. So we should all be able to have a basic conversation anyway in Irish. Now we're just coming back down. We're coming right straight through Dame Street. Coming down Lord Everett Street, we'll come on to Dame Street. We're going to come back down past Dublin Castle. And some of these old street names, you've got Cowes Lane, Wine Tavern Street, Fishamble Street, all dating right back to Viking times here in Dublin. And we're just at the top end now, on our left of the Temple Bar district. Just down the laneway there to my left, you'll see the back entrance into the Clarence Hotel, which is the hotel owned by Bono of the rock group U2. Now they say he bought the hotel because as an up-and-coming rock star, he was thrown out of it one night. He'd come in after a gig with the band. It's a smart hotel, so they took one look at them and threw them all out. 25 years later, he came back and he bought it. Now, Dubliners have been on my left as we're heading down. Connects at the far end to Christchurch. Now, and at the bottom here is Trinity College, so right in front of us. Now you'll see one-way systems here in Dublin. It is usually much quicker to walk in Dublin because what we want to do is we just want to get going. And if you're not coming to Glendalough, that's where you're going to leave us on Nassau Street. And then later on today, we'll get back in from Glendalough. Again, we're going to...
आयरलैंड डबलिन में ये मेट्रो ट्रेन लोकल चलती है जो मेट्रो ट्रेन के अलावा ये ट्रॉम का भी रास्ता है। देखिए आप पटरियाँ देख सकते हैं, शहर के बीच में ये ट्रॉम चलती है। मेरे बाएं तरफ ट्रिनिटी कॉलेज है जो कि आयरलैंड का सबसे पुराना विश्वविद्यालय है। अभी हम इसको अंदर से एक्सप्लोर करेंगे, लेकिन ये इसकी बाउंड्री वॉल है। इस कॉलेज में 7वीं और 8वीं शताब्दी की प्रसिद्ध किताबों की मैन्युस्क्रिप्ट रखी हुई है और बहुत बड़ी लाइब्रेरी है। ट्रिनिटी कॉलेज की बाहर से इमारत, बिल्डिंग बहुत भव्य City College University.
Yeah, so you'll recognise this. We came around past here earlier, just the graph on our right hand side, this big store with the flags outside, Kilkenny design. If anyone would like to use bathrooms or grab a coffee, you'll find it on the first floor at Kilkenny. Which is actually just up the block from your hotel. And until mid-1800s, the canals marked the boundary of the city. Once you came over the canals, you were really out into countryside. Now in 1840, first railway track was laid, coming from the city, more or less in the direction we're headed, going south. That it connected to embassies around. We're going to pass just up the road here the American Embassy, which is one of the few purpose-built embassies here in the city. Horse show, which is one of the biggest social events here in the city in the summer months. It's 5 days of international show jumping, so teams from all over the world, all the horses, all descend here very well at the moment because they are ranked #1 in the world, which is a fantastic achievement because rugby is not the #1 sport here by any means. We have Gaelic football and hurling.